Support for Israel worldwide is collapsing as it carries out a brutal war against the Palestinian population trapped in Gaza. Polling found that support for Israel has declined in 42 out of 43 countries that were surveyed, and globally, support for Israel has fallen on average by 18.5%. In every region of the world, support for Israel is falling very quickly. There is now a net negative view of Israel all across Europe. And furthermore, there's a net negative view of Israel in Russia, in China, in Japan, in South Korea, in Australia, and throughout Southeast Asia. Basically, the only large countries that still significantly support Israel are the United States, India, and Nigeria. Of course, the US government is one of the main sponsors of Israel and is giving it billions of dollars as it carries out war crimes in Gaza. India is currently governed by a very right-wing Hindu nationalist party, the BJP, and its Prime Minister Narendra Modi see Israel as a model for the kind of religious state that they want to create, and they are close economic partners with Israel. And in the case of Nigeria and some parts of Africa, there is a growing population of evangelical Christians and Christian Zionists who are motivated to support Israel by the religious ideology, but they actually often don't really know anything about the political conflicts in Israel-Palestine. I should point out that there's also an increasing number of evangelical Christians across Latin America, and previously there had been more support for Israel because of religious reasons, but all across Latin America, now people are becoming very critical of Israel because of its brutal war in Gaza, and that is true even among many Protestant Christians. In Europe, Asia, Latin America, and in parts of Africa, support for Israel has completely collapsed. While it's committing rampant war crimes against civilians in Gaza, Israel is also completely destroying the civilian infrastructure and blowing up universities intentionally, just blowing up universities, because the goal is that Israel wants to prevent Palestinians from ever returning to Gaza. Its goal is to expel them from their homes, to ethnically cleanse them, and it's genocide. So this obviously explains why, across the planet, people have a very negative view of Israel as it's engaged in genocide. This polling information was originally published in Time magazine in an article titled "New Polling Shows How Much Global Support Israel Has Lost." The article revealed that globally support for Israel has dropped by an average of 18.5 percentage points, and it has fallen in 42 out of the 43 countries polled, especially in countries like China, South Africa, Brazil, and other parts of Latin America. However, what's also very fascinating about this poll is it shows that even in longtime US allies, Israel is extremely unpopular. For instance, in Japan, the total net favorability rating of Israel declined from negative 40% to negative 62%. What does that mean, by the way? What is net favorability? You take the number of people who have a positive view of Israel, and then you subtract the number of people who have a negative view of Israel. So in some ways, this polling is actually a bit conservative. The percentage is not the total percentage of people who have a negative view of Israel. It is the net number of people. So you have to subtract the number who have a positive view. So it's actually more than 62% of people in Japan who have a negative view of Israel, the vast majority of people. Furthermore, in South Korea, there was previously a net favorability view of Israel of negative 5.5, and it has fallen to negative 47.8. Again, that's the total number of people who have a positive view, and then subtracting the total of number of people who have a negative view. So that's the majority of people in South Korea. And even in the United Kingdom, one of the US's closest allies, Israel's net favorability has fallen from negative 17 to negative 30%. This is a huge decline. The United States is now the only remaining rich developed country where there is a net positive view of Israel, and that has slightly declined. There was a previous net favorability of 18.2, and it has fallen 2.2 percentage points to 16%. Now, another very important part of this poll that I should highlight is that US support is also declining around the world because, of course, the United States is sponsoring Israel as it carries out war crimes in Gaza. In Egypt, which is one of the closest US allies in the region, it's actually the second largest recipient of US military aid after Israel. In Egypt, the favorability rating of the United States went from positive, a net positive of 41, to a net negative of negative 15%. That is a massive decline in the favorable views of the United States in Egypt. Furthermore, even in Saudi Arabia, a longtime US ally, the net favorability was positive 12.2% in September. As of December, it had declined to negative 10.5%. So a majority of people in Egypt and Saudi Arabia now have a negative view of the United States. They previously, as of a few months ago, had a positive view. I want to briefly look at an article here published in Foreign Policy titled "Why the Global South Supports Pretoria's ICJ Genocide Case." Of course, the ICJ is the International Court of Justice. And this article says very clearly, quote, "The fact that South Africa has brought the case and that the United States has reflexively opposed it has further diminished U.S. credibility among Africans and shattered the notion that Washington stands for a rules-based order." Now, of course, this is part of the propaganda I was talking about. The Global South has always known that the so-called rules-based order is actually a Western order. They've always known the Western powers are hypocritical and they constantly violate international law when it suits them. In fact, back in 2022, France's former top diplomat, Gérard Araud, who was previously France's ambassador to both the United States and Israel, in 2022, he gave a very revealing interview.
To be frank, I've always been extremely skeptical about this idea of rules-based order. Really, personally, for instance, look, I was the permanent representative to the United Nations. We love the United Nations, but the Americans not too much. And actually, when you look at the hierarchy of the United Nations, everybody there is ours. The Secretary General is Portuguese, he was South Korean, but when you look at all the Undersecretary General, all of them really are either American, French, British, and so on. When you look at the World Bank, when you look at the IMF, and so on. So that's a first element. This order is our order. And the second element is also that actually, this order is reflecting the balance of power in 1945, and is reflecting. You look at the permanent members of the Security Council. Really, people forget that if China and Russia are obliged to oppose their veto, it's because, frankly, the Security Council is most of the time, 95% of the time, has a Western-oriented majority. So this order, frankly, and you can also be sarcastic, because when the Americans basically want to do whatever they want, including when it's against the international law, as they define it, they do it. And that's the vision that the rest of the world has of this order. Really, when I was in the United Nations, is a fascinating spot, because you have ambassadors of all the countries, and you can have conversation with them. And the vision they project of the world, their vision of the world, is certainly not a rules-based order. It's a Western order, and they accuse us of double standard, hypocrisy, and so on and so on.
But getting back to this report in Foreign Policy magazine, it admits that, quote, many nations in the so-called global south perceive blatant hypocrisy in Europe and the United States' condemnation of an illegal occupation in Ukraine, while continuing to staunchly back Israel despite the rising death toll in Gaza and settler violence in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. The United States and Israel are trying to expand this into a regional war. The U.S. is bombing Yemen and Iraq and Syria. Israel, in addition to bombing Gaza and carrying out genocide, Israel is also bombing Lebanon and Syria. The U.S. and Israel are threatening Iran. Most of the casualties are women and children. The vast majority of the Palestinians killed by Israel are civilians. And furthermore, thousands of Palestinians are likely dead, but their bodies have remained uncounted because they've been trapped under rubble, because Israel has destroyed most of the buildings and damaged most of the buildings in Gaza, making almost everyone in the entire Gazan population homeless. And finally, I should point out that there's been a lot of propaganda, not only from the Israeli government, but also from the U.S. government, from President Joe Biden himself, claiming that we supposedly cannot trust the death statistics being reported by the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza. I did a separate video and an article about that, explaining how it's completely bogus, how ironically the U.S. State Department has for many years used the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza's data in its own reports because it has a long history of being accurate, and how numerous scientific studies have been published in the top medical journal, The Lancet. These are peer-reviewed scientific studies that show that the death toll in Gaza is accurate, and if anything, it's probably conservative. It probably understates the number of Palestinians who have been killed by Israel with U.S. backing. I should point out that, as always, Latin America is helping to lead the way in opposition to imperialism and neocolonialism. And numerous countries in Latin America have either publicly endorsed and expressed their support for South Africa's case in the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide. And a few of them, including Mexico and Chile, have also recommended that Israeli officials be charged in the International Criminal Court for war crimes committed in Gaza. And they express the will of many people across the global south who can clearly see that what Israel is doing is an extension of the very same genocidal colonialist crimes committed against the indigenous peoples of the Americas by the European colonialists, by the settler colonialists who founded the United States and Canada and Australia, or the colonial crimes committed in Africa, or the colonial crimes committed in Asia. Nicaragua's foreign ministry published an official statement that said, quote, Nicaragua urges Israel to put an end to its actions against the Palestinian people, to cease its military operations in Gaza, and to respect its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. As a state party to the 1948 Convention, Nicaragua has the duty to prevent and punish genocide, as well as the duty to cooperate to that end. If it were not for Washington's steadfast support, Israel would not be able to carry out these crimes against humanity. Therefore, they are U.S.-Israeli crimes. It's amazing to see how this case that South Africa has introduced against Israel in the International Court of Justice, it's amazing to see how this has led many countries in the global south to speak out, to stand up against neocolonialism and the crimes, historical crimes that continue today of colonialism. So I think this is why Western governments are so concerned about this case at The Hague, because it's opening Pandora's box. So the formerly colonized countries can finally try to get a little justice from the Western imperial powers that colonized them and that stole their wealth and that developed through colonialism and slavery and genocide. This is why the war that Israel is waging with U.S. support is not simply just a war in the region. This is an international conflict, and it is part of a shifting geopolitical order toward a more multipolar world in which the global South countries, which represent the global majority, which have been ostracized and silenced and oppressed for centuries since the rise of European colonialism, are standing up and demanding equality, demanding a voice, demanding new international institutions so they can no longer be enslaved and exploited by the Western capitalist imperialist powers. It's an incredible historical moment. The head of foreign policy for the European Union has made a frank admission. The era of Western dominance has ended, and the countries of the global South, which represent the global majority, have increasing economic and political power, and the West can no longer control the entire world. We are firmly in a multipolar system, not a unipolar system dominated by the Western powers. The top European diplomat wrote, quote, if the current global geopolitical tensions continue to evolve in the direction of the West against the rest, Europe's future risks to be bleak. The era of Western dominance has indeed definitively ended. While this has been theoretically understood, we have not always drawn all practical conclusions from this new reality. In the same article, Borrell acknowledged that the wars in Ukraine and Gaza have accelerated this shift, this geopolitical shift, and he added that the anti-colonial uprisings in the Sahel region of Western and Central Africa have also accelerated this shift. And in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, there are nationalist military governments that have come to power opposing the neo-colonialist policies of France, which controls their currencies and largely dominates their economies. And Borrell warned that this could be a symbol of things to come if more countries around the global south rebel against the Western powers that colonize them. And in this article, the top EU foreign policy official said, quote, "Many in the global south accuse us of double standards. Foreign Affairs warned of the West versus the rest." Britain's major newspaper, The Guardian, published an op-ed titled, "The World is Splintering into the West versus the Rest, and that leaves us all in more danger." The article noted that from Gaza and Ukraine to food insecurity, global problems are linked. Echo chambers and bubbles won't solve them. Foreign Policy magazine published an article titled "The West versus the Rest, Welcome to the 21st Century Cold War." One of the clearest ways to see this is to look at votes in the United Nations General Assembly. And here I have a chart, and the vertical line of the chart shows the average vote in the UN General Assembly of all of the countries on Earth. And if you look, you can see that the West constantly votes as a bloc against the rest of the world. And in particular, the United States is a massive outlier, constantly voting against the rest of the world. And Europe largely votes together, and it votes with the US. And there are only a few outliers, like in the Middle East and North Africa. Israel is one of the main outliers. In the Americas, Colombia historically was one of the outliers. But the vast majority of countries in the United Nations General Assembly vote together. And these are countries in the global south, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And by the way, this chart shows that China votes with the global south, with the majority of the world population consistently. And China's vote is frequently close to the world average in the UN, whereas the West is completely against the world average. This is the US-led imperialist world system predicated on the super exploitation of the formerly colonized countries in the global south, whose economies largely revolve around the export of raw materials and low value added products in very labor-intensive industries, and their cheap labor is exploited by multinational corporations concentrated in the West, in the global North, in the colonizing nations, whose economies are in turn predicated on the export of high value-added products, of capital-intensive industries, and their wages are significantly higher. And the goal of these imperialist nations concentrated in the West is to depress the wages of the global South, to keep them trapped in cycles of dependency. And if you look at the semi-peripheral nations that are economically transforming and moving out of the periphery, they are the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, along with some of the developing economies like in Iran, Indonesia. They are gradually moving out of the underdevelopment and poverty that was imposed on them through centuries of colonial exploitation. And this explains the geopolitical conflicts in the world today. What we're seeing is fundamentally a continuation of the national liberation struggles, the decolonization struggles of the global South that formally ended political colonialism, formal colonialism in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And yet a system of neo-colonialism continued, in which their economies were dominated and in some ways controlled and exploited by the Western capitalist nations. The U.S. Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, has said explicitly that the U.S. needs to work with Europe to slow down China's innovation, because this is how the West can keep the economies of the global South trapped in the cycle of dependency, by preventing them from developing their own advanced technologies, so they are dependent on the advanced technologies produced by the West.
The United States stands completely isolated globally for supporting Israel in this massacre. And the consequences of that are being felt all over the world in shifting alliances, in economic patterns, in changing geopolitical structures, even in the use of the dollar as currency and many other things. There is a massive, a seismic change of geopolitics underway in which the U.S. has chosen nearly total isolation in the world. So contrary to being what Biden in his fantasy thinks, that the world looks to the U.S. for leadership, the world looks at the U.S. aghast. The U.S. stands alone with Israel. Of course, the world's even more aghast at what Israel is doing. Slaughter, and as President Erdogan said, of hospitals and schools, I would add mosques, apartment buildings. This is an attempt stated by the Israelis, although we don't want to hear it, so we try not to hear the actual words that are used, but to make Gaza uninhabitable. And that's got a purpose that also needs to be understood. Israel is not fighting Hamas. Israel is fighting for a greater Israel, which is a kind of messianic biblical idea that now is in political ascendancy in Israel, that Israel has the right to control all of the area. It has the right to control the millions and millions of Palestinians, because some zealots believe, and they are powerful right now, God said so in the book of Joshua sometime around the 5th century BC. And you can't really make this up, because this is 21st century stuff, and it's devastating. And this is what we're siding with. I don't think Americans really understand what is motivating the Israelis. I don't think Americans understand the risk of this war widening very significantly, very dangerously, and very fast. This is what we're up against.
A majority of the countries on Earth have called for a ceasefire to end this conflict. However, one country is standing in the way of peace, and that is the United States. In multiple votes at the United Nations, the US has been one of the only nations on earth to vote against calls for ceasefires or a humanitarian truce. On the 27th of October, there was a vote in the UN General Assembly calling for a humanitarian truce in Gaza. The resolution also demanded humanitarian aid for besieged Palestinian civilians. This resolution had the support of the majority of the planet, including the vast majority of the countries in the global south and in the east. And it was really only the United States that opposed it, along with a few small allies, and many countries in the West also abstained on the vote. And if you look at a map, you can see that it's really clearly the West, or most of the West, against the rest of the world. Now, I want to be clear here. This was a United Nations General Assembly vote. This was not a vote in the Security Council, because the United States also used its veto power on two different votes in the UN Security Council, blocking calls for peace. The US was the only country on the Security Council that voted against the call for humanitarian pauses. So when I say that the US is unilaterally going against the entire world and preventing peace in Gaza by going up against the rest of the international community, I'm not exaggerating. It is literally the United States that is a rogue state that is standing against the entire world and opposing peace in Gaza. Brazil's president, Lula da Silva, gave an interview in which he called for fundamental reform of the UN Security Council and said that the US is abusing this institution. And he said not only should the UN Security Council be expanded to include new countries in the global south, but also there should be no veto power in the UN Security Council. I'm going to play a clip here from that interview with Lula. The 1945 UN is no longer worth anything in 2023. He says, that's why we want to change the number of people and how it works, and the end the right to veto. And then he also condemns Israel's war crimes in Gaza. He says the behavior of Israel doing what it's doing with children, with hospitals. Lula says, he continues, with women and children, more than 5,000 children have already died. There are another 1,250 missing children who are under the rubble in Gaza. Apart from the number of women, the number of pregnant women that I saw yesterday who are expecting a child, and because they're afraid of dying, doctors are performing cesarean sections to see if birth is possible, while the women are still in good health. Women in Gaza who are pregnant are being forced to do C-sections, as the Telegraph in the UK reported, with lights from torches because they have no electricity, because Israel has imposed a full-on blockade on Gaza, preventing electricity, preventing food and water from going in. And if you follow votes at the UN General Assembly, you can see that this pattern is constantly followed, where it's the West against the rest of the world. We can see this in many different cases. The most egregious example is when every single year there's a vote at the UN General Assembly to condemn Nazism and fascism, and the US is consistently, along with Ukraine, one of the only they're the only countries on earth that vote against the resolution condemning Nazism. That is, that they're voting essentially in support of Nazism and fascism. And Canada and Western countries, so Canada, European countries, and Australia often abstain in that, along with Japan and South Korea. This is constant. I mean, this is what Russia refers to as the so-called collective West, which is the US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, and South Korea. They constantly vote together against the rest of the world. We also see basically the same pattern every year with the UN General Assembly vote on the illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. Once again, it's the United States and Israel that vote against the rest of the planet. It's the exact same story every year with the vote on the illegal US blockade against Cuba. That's the most extreme example. In fact, in 2022, there were only 2 countries on earth that voted against this resolution calling to end the US blockade against Cuba. Then in 2021, there was a UN vote to make food a human right. And once again, it was the US and apartheid Israel against the entire world. I should also point out, by the way, that this is basically the same map as the countries that officially recognize the Palestinian armed group Hamas as a terrorist organization. The only countries that voted against the resolution that is in support of Israel's occupation were the United States, Canada, and Hungary, and then of course Israel itself. There was another resolution that was voted on in this meeting, which was Resolution L11, which called for assistance to Palestine refugees. What's incredible about this vote is that the only country in the entire world that voted against it was Israel. Even the United States abstained on this vote, because obviously it would look so bad in terms of public relations if Washington voted against a resolution that called for humanitarian assistance for Palestinian refugees. But don't get your hopes up, because the US voted against another resolution that called for actually providing material funding and support for the main United Nations agency that provides support to Palestinian refugees. There was also the vote on Resolution L10 in the same meeting that called for funding the operations of UNRWA, that is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. And in that case, it was 160 countries that voted in favor, and just 4 countries that voted against, which once again was the US, Canada, Israel, and Micronesia, which is basically, unfortunately, a US colony. There was yet another resolution that looked very similar. The vote looked very similar, and that was Resolution 12 on Palestine refugees' properties and their revenues. So Israel continues to colonize and steal the properties and homes of Palestinian, indigenous Palestinians, and this resolution called for them to be compensated. And once again, the vote was basically the US and Canada against the world. It was 156 countries that voted in support of the resolution and just 6 countries that voted against, and it was basically the exact same vote. And finally, there was one other resolution voted in this meeting of the 4th Committee of the UN General Assembly, and that was on Israel's illegal occupation of Syria's territory, the Golan Heights, and that called upon Israel to desist from changing the physical character, demographic composition, institutional structure, and legal status of the occupied Syrian Golan, and to desist from establishing settlements. And in this case, incredibly, it was two countries against the entire world, the US and Israel, permanent sovereignty of the Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and the Arab population in the occupied Syrian Golan over their natural resources. This resolution emphasized how Israel is exploiting, that is stealing the natural resources of the indigenous Arab population in these occupied territories. And it recognized the right of the Palestinian people to claim restitution, that is legal compensation, as the result of any exploitation, damage, loss, or depletion or endangerment of their natural resources resulting from illegal measures taken by Israel, the occupying power. It also called upon Israel to halt all actions, including those perpetrated by Israeli settlers, that harm the environment, including the dumping of all kinds of waste materials in the occupied Palestinian territory and East Jerusalem, and also in the occupied Syrian Golan, and to cease the destruction of vital infrastructure. And in this case, the vote was, I'm repeating myself so much, but it was again the US and Canada against the entire world.
So the UN General Assembly had a vote, and they approved a resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. But the US voted against it. Now again, let me be clear, let me break this down for you the way the UN works. The power is not with the General Assembly. The General Assembly is like, all the countries. And it's like, let's have a vote to determine what we think is the right thing. Okay, but nothing's actionable here. Where the real decisions get made is in what's called the Security Council, which is a much smaller number of countries that are more powerful. And by the way, the US, of course, has veto power in there. So it's not like the way that these international bodies work makes sense anyway, but still, you had a situation where 153 countries were in favor of a ceasefire. Only 10 were against, and there were 23 abstentions. A lot of these countries that ended up voting with the US are countries that are like, our client states that I'm sure get subsidies from us that we tell them, hey, you'll lose the subsidy if you don't vote the right way. Places like Micronesia or Nauru, right? But the numbers are 153 in favor, 10 against, and guess what? Nothing's going to change.
So South Africa is suing Israel over the genocide they're committing in Palestine. So a spokesperson for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Tuesday accused South Africa of giving political and legal cover to the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel, which triggered the 3-month-long war. The state of Israel will appear before the International Court of Justice at The Hague to dispel South Africa's absurd blood libel. For decades, South Africa has backed the Palestinian cause for statehood. It has likened the treatment of Palestinians to those of black majority in South Africa during the apartheid era, a comparison that Israel vehemently denies. That is ridiculous because that's a crazy comparison because Israel's system is way worse than South Africa's.
Plenty of people part of apartheid will tell you that.
Way worse.
US government officials are threatening the staff of the International Criminal Court at The Hague and telling the ICC that if it issues arrest warrants against top Israeli officials over their war crimes in Gaza, the US government is threatening to invade The Hague in order to protect Israeli officials and to prevent them from facing justice over the war crimes that they are committing against the Palestinian people with US support. And of course, the US government has been providing the vast majority of the weapons that Israel is using in order to carry out these war crimes in Gaza. A dozen Republican senators sent a letter to the prosecutor of the ICC threatening to impose sanctions on him and also threatening to potentially invade The Hague. This letter was leaked to the media. I'm going to look at the letter in a second. It's really an incredible document. But before that, I want to emphasize that it's not just Republicans who are threatening the ICC. This is very much bipartisan. The Joe Biden administration, the Democratic administration, is also pressuring the ICC. There are many reports in the Israeli media that behind the scenes, the Biden administration is also more softly threatening the ICC. So this is really the difference between the two major parties. The Republicans are acting like members of the mafia and threatening to invade The Hague, whereas the Democrats are instead more softly threatening the ICC. But both political parties are threatening the International Criminal Court. And again, it is impossible to overstate the US government's hypocrisy because when the Joe Biden administration came into power in 2021, the Secretary of State Antony Blinken publicly announced the end of sanctions and visa restrictions against the personnel of the ICC. So the Biden administration claimed, look, we're not like Trump. We're not going to threaten the ICC and sanction the ICC like a Republican predecessor did. But now that the ICC is talking about potentially issuing an arrest warrant for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, now the Biden administration is once again threatening the ICC.
The House of Representatives passed a bill to sanction the ICC, the International Criminal Court, over Israeli arrest warrants. 42 Democrats joined Republicans in passing the bill. Now remember, we have a law on the books that the U.S. will invade The Hague if they ever come after us or our allies. There was a time when they tried to avoid the appearance of hypocrisy. Now, they just don't care.
Netanyahu reportedly wants lawyer Alan Dershowitz to represent Israel at the upcoming hearing at The Hague.
According to Axios journalist Barak Ravid, Benjamin Netanyahu wants Alan Dershowitz to represent Israel.
This morning when I discussed it with my friends, Jenny Stern, minor colleagues, we almost all thought it was a joke. These people live in such a bubble, this Jewish supremacist bubble. If you watch the recent interviews he did an amusing one with this Qatari interlocutor, and he said, Alan Dershowitz said, UNICEF is Hamas, UNESCO is Hamas, the climate movement is Hamas, and Human Rights Watch is Hamas. If I can explain for your audience, there is a genocide convention. Israel is a signatory to that convention. South Africa is a signatory to that convention. And South Africa is saying that Israel is guilty of genocide. It's in breach of the convention. Israel says it's not in breach of the convention, and therefore that constitutes what's called a dispute under international law. And that being a dispute, the International Court of Justice, which can arbitrate on disputes pertaining to international conventions, as is the Genocide Convention, the International Court of Justice can decide who's right and who's wrong. But these things are never decided by the merits. They're not decided by the law. They're decided by politics. You can't get around it. And so what do you have now? The ICJ consists of 15 judges. The 15 judges comprise the Security Council and 10 other states. So Russia, China, the US, the UK, and France. It'll be very tough. They need 8 votes. Current members. So America, forget, hopeless cause. Russian, I would say unlikely. Slovakia, maybe a yes. Slovakia, France, I would say 50-50. So we have 2. Morocco, I say a yes. So we have 3. Somalia, probably a yes. That will be 4. China, probably a no or an abstention. Uganda, a no. India, I would say a no.
And he's close with Netanyahu.
Jamaica, maybe a yes. Maybe a yes. Lebanon, a yes. Japan is so terrified of the United States, I would call it a no. Germany, I would call a no. Australia, no, 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 no. Brazil, definitely a yes.
Oh,
so
I got 7?
I got 6.5 because we don't know about France.
Indonesia appeal to the US to do more to stop the atrocities in Gaza. Ceasefire is a must for the sake of humanity.
Thank you. And as we met outside as you got out of the automobile, we had a very important discussion on climate.
Those in Rafah, more than 1 million people cowering under tents and amid rubble and amid the bodies of the slaughtered and the maimed, and the Israeli regime is planning to do it again. Now I ask you, what kind of regime is capable of that atrocity? What kind of regime thinks it could get away with a genocide in front of the world, and when it is indicted for genocide, want to continue? And the answer, Taoiseach, is a regime for whom there are never any consequences, ever. Words of criticism means nothing to Netanyahu. Why do they continue? Why do they think they can do it again? Because there are never any consequences, and the United States continues to give them arms and weapons. European states like Germany and Britain continue to give them arms and weapons, and the European Union gives them favoured trade status, and nobody imposes any sanctions on them. One of the proudest things this country can be proud of is what the Dunn Stores workers did in the mid-1980s by going on strike for 2 years, forcing Ireland to be the first country in the world to impose comprehensive sanctions on apartheid South Africa, which began a domino effect that led to the dismantling of the apartheid regime. Of course, guess who held out till the bitter end to defend that obnoxious regime? The United States and Britain. Same people who are effectively giving the licence to Israel to continue its atrocities. Be brave. Do what this country did with apartheid South Africa. Admit it is an apartheid state, it is an uncivilised state, it is a barbaric state, and that it should have sanctions imposed on it in order to end that apartheid, end that occupation, and end the possibility of the sort of genocidal slaughter we have seen for the last 4 months.
I think my blood is nearly boiling listening to the justification of AMOTs. Like, insulted, Get over yourself with your insult. 30,000 people, innocent people, are killed in the last number of months in Israel's pursuit to get to a small number of Hamas terrorists. And you've no regret. You've no sympathy towards the people that you've killed. It's nearly like they get in the way. And your justification is that Hamas actually used them as a human shield and put them in the way. So that's nearly tough luck. It's appalling, and we are appalled.
Despite the catastrophic death toll it has inflicted, Israel is losing, on the ground and in the courts of public opinion. There's no way that this ends that doesn't leave Israel a pariah state with occupation and apartheid on borrowed time, and they know it. So they're doing everything they can, desperate acts of aggression to provoke a wider conflict with Lebanon, with Iran, with anybody, to draw in the US, to save them from the consequences of their own actions. And as Yemen shows, Butcher Biden is reporting for duty. With Europe's proud genocide by his side, they are the ones who have enabled the continuation of Israeli terror. Without them, it would already be over. So take note, Butcher Biden. The ancestors of the Ireland that you claim to be from disown you. Keep our country out of your mouth. And as for von der Leyen and genocidal Germany, with your words and deeds supporting Israel in the ICJ, not in our name. The people of Europe stand with Palestine and with South Africa.
When you look at the photographs and the pictures and the videos that come from there, and you hear the screams of people screaming as the Israeli government burned men, women and children alive. They burned them alive. And the world stands by while 15,000 children are being slaughtered. 35,000 men and women and children. And it's unbelievable, the genocide that's happening. A child with no head. A child with no head. And the Israeli government say it's a mistake. A mistake? I hope that Benjamin Netanyahu burns in hell the same way them children and their families burned. I hope him and his generals and the fair-like government in Israel, that when their God finally brings him to the resting place, that he deserves to burn in hell. Because what is happening now, not alone is it apartheid, not alone is it atrocity and a war crime, it's just horrific. It's just horrific what they're doing. Where is their soul? Where is the soul of the Israeli people that allows their government to do this to children? Where is their humanity? But today here, the Irish people say, we recognise Palestine. We recognise that they are human beings, just like every one of us. Shame on Israel. Shame on what they've done, and will never be forgotten.
An intense showdown took place in the world of women's basketball. The Irish team declined to partake in the customary handshake with their Israeli counterparts. Basketball Ireland stood firmly behind their players, endorsing their decision not to engage in the traditional pre- and post-game rituals. They communicated to the International Basketball Federation their players' intention to abstain from exchanging formalities and standing during the national anthem. This standoff arose from inflammatory remarks attributed to Israeli players, accusing the Irish team of anti-Semitism.
Today, Ireland, Norway and Spain are announcing that we recognise the state of Palestine. We do so because we believe in freedom and justice as the fundamental principles of international law, and because we believe that permanent peace can only be secured upon the basis of the free will of a free people. From our own history, we know what it means. Recognition is an act of powerful political and symbolic value. It is an expression of our view that Palestine holds and should be able to vindicate the full rights of a state, including self-determination, self-governance, territorial integrity and security.
The UN's top court has ordered Israel to take action to prevent acts of genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, but has stopped short of calling for an immediate ceasefire. Delivering an interim ruling on a case brought by South Africa, the International Court of Justice at The Hague said Israel must ensure that its forces do not commit genocide and take measures to improve the humanitarian situation for Palestinian civilians.
The court considers that, with regard to the present situation, Israel must, in accordance with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention.
You know, if you look at the polling, that's one of the things that they talk about in this piece. If you look at polling over time, it's almost a one-to-one relationship the harsher the conditions imposed by the Israelis or the more brutal attacks that are being waged, the higher the support for the more militant terrorist organizations. When there seems like there's some actual path to peace and prosperity through nonviolent means, lo and behold, support for militant groups like Hamas decreases. It doesn't take rocket scientists. Let's go ahead and put this next piece up on the screen. This is a fascinating report from the BBC. They interviewed a number of political scientists in the West Bank, and they also have some numbers to back up what we've discussed before, which is that support for Hamas in the West Bank, we don't know in Gaza, but in the West Bank has been skyrocketing. One political scientist described the October 7th attacks as a turning point for Palestinians, just as they were a shocking turning point for Israelis. That political scientist said, the people, especially the new generation, are backing Hamas now more than at any other moment. He told me in the previous 30 years, there were no models, no idols for the new generation. Now they see there is something different. A different story is being created. And this was really pretty extraordinary as well, because obviously Fatah and Hamas have been bitter enemies for years as well. But this political scientist theorizes that both Fatah and Hamas are well aware they're complementary to each other. And I think we'll see real integration between the two movements. This is the greatest fear of, Bibi Netanyahu and others who are like-minded. They don't want to see any sort of Palestinian unified front. It's a divide and conquer strategy, and it's also elevating the extremists. So you can say, hey, I've got no partner for peace, even as a majority of Palestinians in Gaza say we want a two-state solution. And even as he and his government are very clear about how they do not want a peaceful two-state solution.
Haaretz reported that Hamas accepted a Gaza ceasefire deal, but Israel turned around at the last minute and rejected it. It honestly doesn't look like Israel really cares that much about ending the war. It very clearly is the case that they want to continue to do the war. The hostages are not their main concern. They virtue signal like the hostages were their main concern, but they did such a relentless bombing campaign that many of their own hostages died in the bombing campaign. You have top government officials kind of admitting that thing number one for us is like wiping out Hamas. Now, even if that means killing 100,000 innocent civilians in Gaza, they don't care. That's their main thing. Again, Hamas's main sticking point is you got to stop the war. We'll give you all the hostages if you stop the war. They've also recently came out and said, we'll lay down our weapons if you do the 1967 borders. None of these things are even getting a response from Israel. And so Netanyahu himself, he was pretending like he wanted a deal, but then when Hamas is like, okay, called his bluff, he's like, no, never mind, I take that back. So as you can see here, to be clear, the U.S. offered Hamas a ceasefire that included an Israeli withdrawal from the entire Gaza Strip in exchange for releasing all the Israeli POWs, which Hamas accepted. But Israel then rejected. Can absolutely guarantee U.S. media will not report it this way. That's exactly right.
Having vetoed a ceasefire resolution at the United Nations on 3 separate occasions, the Biden administration is now blaming Hamas for the absence of a ceasefire.
Resolution before the UN Security Council to call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza was shot down today. The only country out of the 15-member council to vote against it, the U.S. Eyewitness News reporter Darla Miles with more on the decision from the newsroom. Darla.
Well, David, this is the third time since the October 7th attacks that the U.S. has used its veto power to kill a resolution that calls for an immediate ceasefire. And after the vote this morning, the U.S. and the UN Security Council have been strongly condemned by other countries on the council for inaction so far.
It's really such a hypocritical approach. I mean, the United States has been, like you said, primarily the force blocking a ceasefire. They're not proposing a ceasefire, they're proposing a truce. And I think the amount of both public pressure inside the United States and international isolation that they're suffering from has forced them to try to now start adopting the language of ceasefire, saying that there's a ceasefire deal on the table, that they want a ceasefire. And they're using that as a way to put the blame on Hamas, whose position has been quite firm throughout the past weeks in negotiations. They've been saying a truce is not sufficient. What we want is a permanent ceasefire. And so the United States is trying to manipulate language, I think primarily directed at their own public, to make it seem like the United States is on the side of a ceasefire. But really what they're proposing is a truce. Even in the United Nations, their draft proposal, has not been amended to include a ceasefire. It's still specifying a 6-week truce. So it's a very hypocritical position of the United States and quite manipulative in the arena of the media.
Well, we're going to talk about what Hamas wants. What is Hamas actually saying at the negotiating table? People, especially in the United States, don't know, because if they're getting their news from the mainstream media, they're not being told. It's all demonization, caricaturing Hamas, not representing what the real position is. So we're going to talk about that, and I know you have been following that quite carefully. Let's talk about and focus on what Hamas wants.
Sure. So Hamas yesterday delivered what it's calling its final response. And just to note, Hamas has been very willing to engage in the negotiating process. In fact, it's been the Israeli delegation that has wavered and actually withdrew from the negotiations. And so they were not even present at the negotiating table yesterday when this was delivered. And so Hamas now, after some rounds of going back and forth, and actually we talked about it on the show a couple weeks ago, now the final response is pretty significant. Hamas is insisting, first of all, that this agreement leads to a permanent ceasefire, not simply a truce. Secondly, that the cessation of military operations would occur 1 week before any exchange of hostages happens. In fact, that Hamas is saying that they need the military operations and assaults to stop in order to gather their forces and then complete the hostage exchange. They are saying also that they are not going to accept any partial withdrawing of the Israeli occupation forces. What they are asking for, and they have been very clear and firm on, is that there would be a full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And that from the first day of the beginning of the deal, there would be no restriction on the entry of aid, including the moving of aid within the occupied Gaza territory. Specifically, that the checkpoints and security squares and the different kinds of things that the Israelis have set up to manage movement within Gaza, that they be removed, and that aid is able to flow freely throughout both the north and the south. That people are allowed to return to their homes and their region of Gaza without restriction, in particular to the north. And then that there is a specific list of they're asking for the exchange for the hostages that are still remaining in the Gaza in under Hamas control. And that list of prisoners would include certain high-profile people who are facing multiple life sentences or really high sentences, people that Israel has refused to release before in the past, like Marwan Barghouti, Ahmed Saadat, and others, and Abdullah Barghouti and Ibrahim Hamid and other senior officials from the Hamas movement. They're very specific about this, that this would be a requirement for the prisoner exchange, that they would be able to receive prisoners with these very high sentences, and also a guarantee that people would not be re-detained or re-arrested after the release. In 2011, with the other very major prisoner release in exchange for the release of Israeli hostage Shalitz, there were about 47, I believe, Palestinians who were released in that deal and then were rearrested. And they are actually also asking for those who were rearrested to also be released. So there's specific requirements being put on the release of prisoners in exchange for hostages, some of which have been carried forward from previous rounds of negotiations. And they're being very clear about this. They've presented these demands. They've said that they will remain firm on these demands. This is in rejection of the very vague and temporary proposal that has been put on the table by the U.S. and Israel via the mediators, which really still only specified 6-week truce, did not include a full withdrawal of the occupation forces. It proposed things like reducing aerial reconnaissance for just 8 hours a day, not a full reduction, not a full dismantling of Israeli surveillance on the population of Gaza. It still had restrictions on aid. It had only specified certain amounts of aid. So you can see that Hamas is being very insistent that they're not going to accept these partial proposals that would actually just result in an Israeli administration of Gaza, and that would prepare the ground again for a resumption of the assault on Gaza after that 6-week period. So, when we're talking about a ceasefire, it's really Hamas that is actually proposing the terms for an actual ceasefire, an end to this genocidal war. What is being proposed from the U.S. and Israeli side is just a pause, and that's very significant and very important. It's unclear what's going to happen. Israel has been consistently rejecting these terms.
All right, this is really important, everybody, for people to wrap their head around it, because what the Israelis were basically demanding is that the hostages be released, and in exchange, some Palestinian prisoners would be released. The Israeli Defense Forces would remain in and around Gaza, that they would continue to carry out aerial surveillance to try to pinpoint Hamas positions, undoubtedly, that they would not allow full amounts of humanitarian aid to enter into the Gaza Strip. In other words, that they would be basically having a chokehold over what kind of humanitarian aid comes in.